Rick and Morty looks like a cartoon about a genius grandpa dragging his scared grandson through space. Simple enough, except a growing number of fans stopped watching it as comedy. What they found changes how this entire family looks. In this video, we break down every insane Rick and Morty theory ever. The ticket number that broke the multiverse. Rick and Morty spends its whole first season pretending to be a simple show about a wild grandfather and his nervous grandson. Then, in the very last episode of that season, the floor drops out. Rick is arrested by an entire society of other Ricks, all living together in one place, all treating him like a criminal instead of a stranger. That episode reveals something the show had only hinted at before. Rick is not one man having adventures. Rick is one version of a man who exists in countless copies, spread across countless versions of the same universe, each one raising a version of the same grandson, each one making a version of the same portal gun. Once that idea lands, the show could have treated it like background noise. Instead, it kept building on it, quietly, in small moments that most viewers laughed at and moved past. One of those small moments happened early in Season 2, in an episode called Morty Night Run, and it created one of the strangest and most persistent theories the fandom has ever produced. The theory does not come from a big reveal or a dramatic twist. It comes from a number on a piece of paper. At the start of that episode, Rick needs to get Jerry out of the house so he and Morty can go on an adventure without him tagging along and causing problems. Rather than leaving Jerry at home, Rick drops him off at a place called Jerry Buree. It looks and functions almost exactly like a daycare center, except every single person being dropped off is a grown man named Jerry. The staff greet him by number. Jerry receives a ticket, and that ticket has a specific number printed on it, one that places him far down a very long line of other Jerrys who have already been checked in that day, from other families, from other versions of the exact same story. That single detail is the entire seed of the theory. If there is a working system for dropping off Jerrys, staffed and organized enough to hand out numbered tickets in the thousands, then dropping off a Jerry is not a rare event. It is something that happens constantly, over and over, across a staggering number of realities. Every one of those tickets represents a different Rick doing the exact same thing our Rick is doing on the exact same kind of day for the exact same reason. The show never says this directly. It does not need to. The ticket says it for them. From there, fans started asking a harder question. If dropping off a Jerry at Jerry Buree is this common, and if the Rick and Morty pairing we are watching is just one version among many identical setups, how do we know which pair we are actually watching at any given moment? The show is not shy about admitting that different Ricks and Mortys look and act almost the same. Their personalities carry over, their habits carry over, their relationships with their families carry over in shape, if not in every detail. If that is true, then a Rick and Morty pair from one reality could, in theory, slot into an episode meant for a completely different pair, and most viewers would never notice a difference. This is where the theory earns its name. Fans began calling it the ticket theory, built around the idea that certain episodes of the show, especially the ones that do not connect directly to the ongoing story with Evil Morty or the Citadel, might not even be following the same Rick and Morty from episode to episode. Instead, some of those episodes could be showing a different, nearly identical pair dropped into a story that looks the same on the surface because nearly every version of this family behaves the same way when placed in a similar situation. To understand why this theory grew instead of dying out, it helps to look at how the show is actually built behind the scenes. Rick and Morty runs on two different kinds of episodes. Some episodes clearly build towards something bigger, moving pieces around that matter later, like the fall of the Council of Ricks or the reappearance of Evil Morty. Other episodes stand completely on their own, telling a full story with a beginning and an end, with no clear connection to anything before or after it. For years, the show treated these standalone episodes as simple, low-stakes fun, a break from the heavier plot threads. The ticket theory reframes those standalone episodes entirely. Instead of being throwaway adventures starring the same two characters we have followed since the pilot, they might be a rotating cast of nearly identical strangers, each one living out a slightly different version of the same rough sketch of a life. The visual choices in the Jerry Buree scene make this idea land harder than the dialogue alone ever could. The room is packed with Jerrys. Not 2 or 3 background extras dressed the same way for a quick joke, but a genuinely large crowd, filling out the space the way a real waiting room fills out with strangers who have nothing in common except the reason they showed up that day. The camera does not linger on this crowd for very long, and it never asks the audience to take it seriously. It is played as a joke about how pathetic Jerry is, one weak man among an army of equally weak men. But the joke only works because the show has quietly quietly built a rule that supports it. If there are enough Jerrys to fill a waiting room and issue tickets in the thousands, there are enough Ricks dropping them off to make that possible. The comedy sits right on top of a genuinely enormous structural fact about how this universe works, and the show trusts the audience to laugh without stopping to measure exactly how big that fact really is. That gap between what the scene is doing and how the scene is delivered is where a lot of the show's best background world building lives. Rick and Morty rarely announces its lore with a speech or a title card explaining the rules. It tends to let the rules sit quietly inside a joke, trusting that some viewers will laugh and move on, while others will pause the episode and start doing the math on ticket numbers. Both reactions are intentional. The show wants the joke to work on its own, and it also wants the deeper implication to be there for anyone willing to dig for it. Morty Night Run is doing exactly that. On the surface, it is a stressed-out grandpa dumping his least favorite family member somewhere out of the way. Underneath that, it is quietly telling the audience that the story they are watching may only be one thread in a rope made of thousands of nearly identical threads, all pulled from the same source, all fraying in slightly different directions. The deeper you sit with this, the stranger the implications become. If Jerry Burry exists on this scale, then somewhere out there is a Rick who dropped off his Jerry an hour earlier that same day, went on his own version of a black market adventure, and came home to a Morty who looked, sounded, and acted almost exactly like ours. That Rick probably yelled at that Morty the same way. That Morty probably felt the same nervous mix of fear and loyalty that our Morty feels. None of this is treated as a tragedy by the show. It is treated as background trivia, a fact about how the world works that nobody inside the story seems bothered by. That casual attitude might be the most unsettling part of the whole idea. The characters we have grown attached to are not unique the way a family in a normal television show would be unique. They are one version of a pattern that repeats itself an almost uncountable number of times, and the show is telling us this through a background gag about a waiting room, without asking us to feel anything about it at all. This connects to something that runs underneath the entire franchise, even in episodes that never mention the multiverse directly. Rick and Morty is a show about a family that keeps repeating the same mistakes. Jerry keeps being weak. Beth keeps struggling to decide whether she is more like her father than she wants to admit. Summer keeps trying to matter to people who barely notice her. Morty keeps getting dragged into danger he never asked for. The ticket theory takes that pattern of repetition, which had always lived inside one single family across one single timeline, and stretches it across the entire multiverse. Every mistake this family makes is not just something that happened once. It is something happening constantly, in slightly different forms, in an uncountable number of other homes that look almost exactly like this one. The show rarely says this out loud, but the Jerry Burry scene is one of the clearest moments where it lets that idea slip through. Hidden inside a number on a ticket. Fans latched onto this specific detail for a reason that goes beyond simple curiosity about the multiverse. Once you accept that different episodes might be following different, nearly identical pairs of Rick and Morty, the entire show starts to feel less like a continuous story about two specific people, and more like a long series of case studies about a type of person, repeated with small variations. That shift changes how a viewer experiences even the emotional moments. If the crying, frustrated Morty in one standalone episode is not the same Morty who bonded with his grandfather 2 episodes earlier, then the emotional weight the audience has been building toward one specific relationship starts to feel less stable. It becomes harder to know exactly who you are supposed to be following, and whether the growth one version of Morty experiences carries over to the version watching next week. This is also why the theory refuses to go away, even years after the episode that inspired it first aired. It does not require any secret confirmation from the creators to feel true. It only requires the audience to take one small, mostly comedic detail seriously and follow the logic all the way to its natural endpoint. The show gave viewers a number. Viewers gave that number a meaning far heavier than the joke ever intended. And once that meaning existed, it became almost impossible to watch a standalone episode of Rick and Morty the same way again. Every time the credits roll on an episode that does not connect to the larger story, some part of the audience is left wondering whether they just watched two characters they know or two strangers wearing a very familiar shape. None of this required the show to add new lore or introduce a shocking twist. It only required one background detail, delivered quickly and without emphasis, to be noticed by the right person and shared widely enough to take on a life of its own. That is the pattern behind almost every strange theory this fandom has built. The wildest ideas rarely come from the episodes built to shock you. They come from the quiet ones, the ones that slide a piece of information past the audience so casually that most people forget it by the next scene, while a small number of people never forget get it at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern of noticing something small and following it somewhere much darker is about to show up again, and this next version of it does not stay comfortable the way the ticket theory does. It starts with a single moment of stillness on Rick's face, a moment most viewers read as nothing more than a strange joke, and it ends with a question about whether the grandfather sitting at that dinner table every night is really the man his family thinks he is. Section 2. The family that buried the wrong bodies. There is a piece of information sitting in the middle of Rick and Morty that most viewers walk past without stopping. It does not arrive with music, it does not arrive with a slow zoom or a dramatic pause. It arrives in a rushed, panicked conversation near the end of the first season, delivered so quickly that a person watching casually could miss the entire weight of what just got said. That piece of information is this: the Beth, Jerry, and Summer that the audience has been watching since the very first episode are not actually related to the Rick and the Morty who raised them. Not by blood, not by memory. Not by anything except proximity, and a decision made in about 30 seconds during a crisis. This is not a fan theory pulled from a stray line of dialogue or a background detail nobody was supposed to notice. It is stated plainly, on screen, by the characters themselves in the final episode of Season 1, called Rick Potion Number 9. What the fandom built on top of that fact, however, is where things get strange, and where a small, mostly ignored piece of confirmed canon turns into one of the darkest theories the show has ever produced. The setup for this reveal begins with something almost embarrassingly small. Morty wants a girl at school named Jessica to like him. Rather than help him talk to her like a normal person, Rick offers a shortcut. He creates a love potion, something that will chemically force Jessica to develop feelings for Morty. Morty accepts. It goes wrong almost immediately. The potion spreads beyond Jessica, first catching a teacher, then a group of students, and finally the entire population of the planet, because the effect works like a virus, jumping from person to person on contact. Within a single school day, half the town has been infected, and every symptom points toward the same outcome that any virus in this kind of story eventually points toward. People stop acting like people. Rick attempts a fix. He always does. He creates a cure meant to reverse the effects of the potion, but instead of returning everyone to normal, the cure interacts badly with the virus and produces something far worse. The infected population begins physically transforming into grotesque, deformed creatures, twisted versions of human beings with extra limbs, exposed organs, and faces stretched into shapes no longer recognizable as faces. The show does not hide this transformation behind a cutaway or a joke that softens the horror. It shows it directly in full animated detail, turning what started as an awkward teenage crush into a full-blown planetary catastrophe within the space of about 15 minutes of screen time. Rick is, for one of the only times in the entire series, completely out of solutions. There is no formula left to try, no gadget in his lab that reverses what has already happened. The planet Morty and Rick have always called home is now populated entirely by monsters, and there is no fixing it. Rather than face the consequences of what he caused, Rick makes a choice that says everything about who he is as a character, and everything about how the rest of the show is going to treat consequences from that point forward. He does not stay and try to help. He does not turn himself in or attempt some kind of desperate last measure to reverse the damage. He builds a portal, grabs Morty, and leaves. The two of them travel to a neighboring dimension, one nearly identical to their own, differing by only a small handful of details. In this new dimension, the show reveals something that reframes everything the audience thought they understood about the family at the center of the story. This other dimension had its own Rick and its own Morty, and that other pair had already solved the exact same Cronenberg crisis, successfully curing their own population before our Rick and Morty ever showed up. Unfortunately for that other Rick and Morty, the process of fixing the disaster ended with a garage explosion, and both of them died in the accident, moments after saving their world. This is the detail that changes everything. Our Rick, upon discovering two dead bodies in a garage that belong to versions of himself and his own grandson, does not react with horror, grief, or even mild discomfort. He reacts with the calm, practical energy of a man solving a logistics problem. He and Morty drag the two corpses out to the backyard, dig a hole, and bury them. Then they walk into the house, greet a Beth, a Jerry, and a Summer who have never seen either of them before in their lives, and simply take over the lives of the family members who used to live there. Nobody in that family ever finds out. As far as Beth, Jerry, and Summer are concerned, nothing has changed. Their father, their husband, their grandfather walk through the door exactly like he always does. In reality, the man walking through that door has never met met any of them until that exact moment. The show plays this entire sequence for dark comedy. Rick's line explaining the plan is delivered with the same flat, unbothered tone he uses for almost every other decision he makes throughout the series. There is no music cue signaling how the audience is supposed to feel. There is no lingering shot on the freshly dug graves. The scene moves on almost as quickly as it arrived, and the show never brings this specific detail up again in any meaningful way for years. Most casual viewers, watching the episode once and moving on to the next one, absorb this information the same way they absorb any other joke in the episode, filing it away as one more strange, morbid gag in a show full of them. But for a portion of the fandom, this scene became something closer to a foundational fact, one that quietly recontextualizes every single family dinner, every fight, every emotional moment the show produces from that point forward. If the Beth, Jerry, and Summer we watch for the rest of the series are not the same Beth, Jerry, and Summer that this Rick and this Morty originally belonged to, then every relationship on the show is built on a kind of quiet impersonation. Beth's complicated feelings about her father, the one she spends multiple seasons working through in therapy and in private confrontations, are not actually about the man who raised her. They are about a stranger who buried her real father in the backyard and then answered to his name for years without ever correcting the record. Jerry's constant need for Rick's approval, the insecurity that defines nearly every interaction between the two of them, is aimed at a man who has no actual history with him beyond a single decision made in a moment of crisis. Even Summer, who spends much of the show trying to prove she matters as much as Morty does, is directing that need at a grandfather who did not watch her grow up, who has no real memory of her first steps or her childhood birthdays, because he was living an entirely different life in an entirely different dimension until the day he buried his replacement's body in her backyard. This single confirmed fact, treated by the show as a throwaway plot device to explain why nothing changes permanently after a season-ending disaster, became the seed for one of the more unsettling threads of theorizing in the entire fandom. Because if Rick was willing to bury two corpses and walk into a stranger's house without a flicker of hesitation, the obvious question becomes whether this was the first time he has ever done something like this. And that question leads directly into one of the darker corners of Rick and Morty fan discussion, one built around a much smaller, much quieter moment from a completely different episode. That moment comes from an episode called Autoerotic Assimilation, which is mostly remembered by casual viewers for its bizarre and uncomfortable plot involving Rick's ex-girlfriend Unity, a hive-mind entity capable of controlling entire populations of people at once. Underneath that plot, however, is a much quieter subplot involving Beth, Summer, and Jerry, who spend the episode slowly piecing together just how much damage Rick's presence has actually done to their family. By the end of the episode, after Unity leaves him and Rick is left alone with the full weight of what his choices have cost the people around him, he sits in his lab, picks up one of his own weapons, a device capable of instantly vaporizing anything it touches, and points it directly at his own head. The show does not treat this scene as a joke. It plays it with an unusual amount of stillness for a series that almost never slows down. Rick sits there, gun aimed at his own skull, for several long seconds. There is no last-second rescue. There is no dramatic intervention from another character bursting through the door. Rick simply passes out from the amount of alcohol he has consumed before he is forced to make a final decision either way, and the scene ends there, ambiguous and deeply uncomfortable, sitting somewhere between a suicide attempt and an accident that happened to interrupt one. Taken on its own, this scene functions as a rare moment of honesty about the cost of Rick's lifestyle, a brief crack in his usual armor of jokes and detachment. But once fans started connecting it back to the buried bodies reveal from Rick Potion number 9, the scene took on a much darker second meaning. If Rick has demonstrated, on screen, both a documented willingness to end his own life and a documented history of stepping into a dead man's role without hesitation, some fans began asking a question the show never directly answers. What if the Rick currently living with Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty is not simply a man who once buried two strangers and moved on? What if he is a man who has done this more than once, jumping from dimension to dimension, replacing versions of himself that died, possibly even replacing a version of himself that chose to die, long before the events of the show ever began? This idea gains a strange kind of traction specifically because of how calm Rick is in the burial scene. A person burying the body of a version of themselves for the first time might reasonably be expected to show some kind of reaction, even a small one. Rick shows nothing. He handles the entire situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who already knows exactly what to do, as if this is simply a procedure he has followed before, rather than a horrifying first-time experience. That calmness is not proof of anything on its own. The show gives Rick plenty of other reasons to be numb to horror by this point in the story, given everything he has already survived and and caused throughout his life. But for fans looking closely at his behavior, that specific kind of practiced calm, paired with a canon-confirmed suicide attempt just a handful of episodes later, created enough overlap to build an entire theory around. The theory suggests something like this. At some point before the events of the series, the original Rick belonging to Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty's family did not simply grow distant or abandon them the way the show's later flashbacks suggest. Instead, that original Rick killed himself, unable to live with the weight of whatever failures or losses defined his life at that point. Rather than the family dealing with that loss directly, a different Rick, one from another dimension entirely, one who may have lost his own family to a different disaster, arrived and slipped into the empty space left behind, the same way he does later with the Cronenberg family in Rick Potion number 9. Under this theory, the Rick raising Morty throughout the entire series is not simply eccentric or emotionally guarded because of general trauma. He is living a borrowed life, standing in the exact shape of a man who chose to disappear rather than face the people who loved him. And every time Rick pulls away from real intimacy with his family, he might be avoiding a truth even darker than typical guilt. He might be avoiding the reality that he is not entitled to their love at all, because the man who actually earned it made a permanent decision to leave it behind. None of this is stated directly by the show. Unlike the Rick Potion number 9 reveal, which is spoken plainly by the characters themselves and treated as settled fact within the story, this deeper layer remains entirely speculative, built by fans stacking one confirmed detail on top of one ambiguous scene and drawing a line between them that the writers have never confirmed or denied. It is important to hold that distinction clearly. The burial of the two bodies is not a theory. It happened, on screen, exactly as described, and the show has never walked it back or explained it away. The idea that this specific Rick may have done something similar before, possibly involving his own suicide in an earlier version of this exact family, is fan speculation, built from behavioral evidence rather than direct confirmation. What makes this speculation persist anyway, rather than fading the way most unconfirmed fan theories eventually do, is how well it fits the show's broader pattern of treating identity as something unstable and replaceable rather than fixed. Rick and Morty rarely lets its characters stay who they appear to be for very long. Clones appear and vanish. Memories get implanted, edited, or wiped entirely. Alternate versions of nearly every character show up throughout the series, often behaving in ways different enough from the versions the audience knows to raise real questions about what, if anything, makes any single version of these people the true one. Against that backdrop, the idea that even Rick himself, the character positioned as the show's central, stabilizing force despite his chaos, might not be a fixed and singular person either, fits disturbingly well with everything else the show has already shown its audience to be true. There is also a craft-level reason this theory lands the way it does, separate from the plot details alone. The animation and voice work in both key scenes share a specific quality of restraint that the show rarely uses elsewhere. Rick Potion number 9 could have played the discovery of the two bodies as horror, using lighting, music, or a slower pace to emphasize how disturbing the moment actually is. Instead, it moves through the scene at the same rushed, comedic pace as the rest of the episode, refusing to let the audience sit with the weight of what just happened. Autoerotic assimilation does the opposite. It slows down specifically for the gun scene, stripping away music, holding on Rick's face longer than the show usually holds on anything, forcing the audience to actually watch him consider ending his own life rather than cutting away quickly to soften it. Two opposite choices, pacing something horrifying like a joke in one episode and pacing something quiet like a tragedy in another. Both point toward the same underlying idea. Death, in this show, is treated as something Rick has made peace with far more completely than any of the people around him realize, whether that peace comes from having caused death many times before, or from having once tried to choose it for himself. The emotional weight underneath all of this connects directly to something Beth says in a different episode entirely, when she finally confronts the possibility that her father has never really loved their family the way a normal parent does. She is not wrong to feel that distance. The show gives her every reason to feel it. What the burial scene and the suicide attempt scene add to that feeling, when placed next to each other, is a possible explanation for why that distance exists that goes even further than simple selfishness or addiction. A man haunted by having replaced a version of himself who chose not to exist anymore would have very good reasons to keep everyone around him at arm's length. Not because he does not care, but because caring too deeply might force him to confront exactly how little claim he actually has to the life he is currently living. This reading also changes how a specific kind of Rick behavior gets interpreted throughout the rest of the series. Every time Rick deflects packs a genuine emotional moment with a joke. Every time he chooses chaos over stillness, every time he runs from a quiet family dinner toward an interdimensional crisis instead. The theory offers a possible reason underneath the obvious one. The obvious explanation is that Rick is simply avoidant, a genius who never learned healthy coping mechanisms and self-medicates through science and alcohol instead. The theory adds a second, darker possibility, sitting quietly behind the first. Stillness might be dangerous for Rick specifically because stillness is where a man might start asking questions about who he actually is, why the family in front of him accepted him so easily, and whether the man who used to sit in his exact chair chose to leave that chair permanently empty on purpose. It is worth being honest about how far this theory reaches beyond what the show has actually confirmed. Rick Potion number 9 gives fans a real, undeniable, on-screen fact. Autoerotic assimilation gives fans a real, undeniable, on-screen moment of near suicide. The bridge connecting those two facts into a single unified theory about Rick's entire history with this specific family is built by fans, not by the writers, and it remains just that, a bridge, standing on solid ground at both ends, but resting on speculation in the middle. That is exactly why it belongs on a list of theories rather than a list of confirmed plot points. It takes something the show definitely did and something the show definitely showed, and it asks a question neither scene was originally written to answer. What makes the theory worth taking seriously anyway, even without confirmation, is how naturally it fits into everything Rick and Morty has spent years demonstrating about its own characters. This is a show built almost entirely around the idea that identity is fragile, replaceable, and far less special than the people living inside it want to believe. Clones replace originals without anyone noticing the difference. Broken timelines get patched over by characters who simply move into someone else's unfinished story. A grandfather can bury 2 bodies in a backyard and walk inside for dinner 5 minutes later without missing a beat. Against a show willing to treat identity that casually in scenes it fully confirms, the idea that Rick's own identity might carry a similar kind of quiet substitution underneath it does not feel like a stretch. It feels like the show simply extending a rule it already established to the one character everyone assumed was exempt from it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That exemption, the assumption that whatever happens to everyone else, Rick himself remains constant and unreplaceable, is exactly the assumption this theory challenges. And once that assumption cracks even slightly, it opens the door to a different kind of question altogether, one that does not involve Rick at all. Section 3. The boy Rick left behind on a rock. Every theory about Rick faking his way into someone else's life eventually runs into a smaller, quieter version of the exact same idea. Except this time, it does not involve an adult who has already lived through decades of loss and regret. It involves a child left behind on a hostile planet in the very first scene of the very first episode, long before anyone watching had any reason to think that moment mattered at all. The scene happens fast, almost too fast to register on a first watch. Rick and Morty are running across a rocky alien landscape, chased by something dangerous enough that Rick needs a shortcut out. He fires a portal gun, creates an opening between dimensions, and jumps through it with Morty right behind him. Except only one of them makes it. The Morty running alongside Rick in that opening shot does not follow him through the portal. He is left standing there, alone, on a planet that was actively trying to kill him seconds earlier, while Rick disappears without looking back. For years, most viewers treated this as nothing more than a fast, chaotic cold open, a quick joke meant to establish how reckless Rick is before the actual story of the episode begins. The show does not pause to explain what happened to that abandoned Morty. It does not bring him up again. The episode moves forward as if nothing unusual occurred, following a different version of events entirely, one where Morty appears to be safely at home the whole time. On the surface, the scene reads like a throwaway gag about Rick's carelessness, nothing more. Fans started asking harder questions once a very different Morty showed up later in the season, in the finale episode, one whose entire presence in the story depends on being nearly identical to the Morty audiences already knew, while also being fundamentally different underneath. That episode is called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, and it introduces something the show had never shown before: an organized society made up entirely of different versions of Rick, living together across an enormous city-sized structure that exists specifically because there are enough Ricks scattered across the multiverse to justify building one. Inside that structure, Rick is quickly identified as a suspect in the murder of another Rick, one whose body was found without a Morty anywhere nearby. The Society of Ricks assumes this is significant, since every functioning Rick is supposed to travel with a Morty at all times, for a very specific and clearly explained reason. Morty's brainwaves work like a kind of static, one that scrambles a Rick's own genius-level brain signals just enough to make him harder to track and harder to detect. Without a Morty nearby, a Rick becomes easier to find, easier to predict, and far more vulnerable to the kind of enemies that spend their lives hunting geniuses like him. This detail matters enormously to everything that follows, because it means a Morty is never just a sidekick or a companion in this universe. A Morty is closer to a piece of equipment, one so essential to a Rick's safety that losing one is treated as a serious tactical problem rather than a personal tragedy. Once the Society of Ricks accepts this as fact, the story shifts toward finding the real culprit behind the murder, and that search eventually leads to a very different kind of Rick entirely, one working alongside a Morty who looks almost exactly like every other Morty in the room, aside from one small detail. This particular Morty wears an eye patch. The eye patch alone does not explain much on its own. Plenty of characters across the show carry small physical differences without any of it meaning something deeper. What makes this specific Morty different becomes clear once the true culprit behind the murder is revealed. It is not the Rick working with the eye patch Morty at all. It is the Morty himself. This particular Morty has been manipulating a rogue Rick from behind the scenes the entire time, using him as a tool to commit murders across the Society of Ricks, all while playing the part of an ordinary, harmless sidekick in front of everyone else in the room. The reveal lands as a shock specifically because of how completely the show has trained its audience, by this exact point in the story, to see every Morty as basically interchangeable, harmless, and secondary to whichever Rick he happens to be standing next to. This Morty breaks that pattern entirely. He is intelligent enough to manipulate a fully grown genius into committing violence on his behalf, patient enough to hide that intelligence behind a completely convincing performance of ordinary childhood nervousness, and ruthless enough to walk away from the consequences without a flicker of guilt once his plan falls apart. The show gives this character a nickname almost immediately, one that sticks with him for the rest of the series. Fans and other characters alike start calling him Evil Morty, and the name never really goes away. At this point in the story, nothing officially connects this specific Morty back to the boy abandoned on a rocky planet during the opening seconds of the pilot episode. The show does not draw a direct line between the two moments, and years passed before the idea that they might be connected really took hold across the fandom. But once fans started looking for a reason why Evil Morty might hate Rick specifically, rather than simply being a naturally cold or manipulative kid, the abandoned Morty from the pilot became an obvious place to start looking. The logic works like this. If Rick truly did leave one specific Morty behind on a hostile planet as a child, with no plan to return and no apparent guilt about doing so, that Morty would have grown up shaped by an experience none of the other Mortys across the multiverse ever had to survive. Every other Morty the show introduces grows up alongside a Rick who, whatever his flaws, at least keeps them physically present and mostly protected. The abandoned Morty, under this theory, grew up learning an entirely different lesson before he ever had the chance to learn anything else. He learned that a Rick will leave you behind the moment staying becomes inconvenient, and that lesson, absorbed early enough and painfully enough, could easily explain why one specific Morty eventually decided that manipulating and destroying Ricks was not just acceptable, but justified. This connection remains something the show has never directly confirmed in dialogue. No character ever turns to Evil Morty and states plainly that he is the same Morty who was left behind on that planet years earlier. What the show does instead is something closer to visual suggestion, the kind of storytelling choice that rewards close attention without ever spelling itself out in plain language. The design of Evil Morty, his exact haircut, his exact build, his general appearance closely matches the design of the specific Morty seen fleeing alongside Rick in that opening pilot scene, more closely than it matches most other background Mortys who appear throughout the rest of the series. That similarity alone became one of the strongest pieces of evidence fans point to when arguing that these two moments, separated by years of episodes, are actually describing the exact same character at two very different points in his life. The theory gained even more weight once the story returned to Evil Morty years later, in an episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, one that abandons Rick and Morty almost entirely in favor of following life inside the Society of Ricks and Mortys on its own terms. That episode reveals an entire government structure built specifically to manage relationships between countless versions of Rick and countless versions of Morty, complete with its own economy, its own police force, and its own political system. One currently in the middle of an election. One storyline inside that episode follows a Morty running for a position of real power within that government, campaigning on the idea that Mortys deserve more respect and more independence from the Ricks, who have always treated them as disposable tools rather than equals. This candidate speaks with real confidence, real strategy, and a level of political instinct that no other Morty across the entire series has ever displayed. He wins the election convincingly, defeating opponents who assumed a Morty could never outmaneuver them. In the final moments of the episode, once the celebration ends and the new position of power officially belongs to him, the show reveals his face clearly enough for the audience to recognize exactly who has just won control over an entire society built around managing Ricks. It is the same Morty from the murder investigation years earlier. The eye patch is gone, but the face underneath it belongs to evil Morty. This reveal accomplishes two things at once. It confirms, without any ambiguity, that this specific Morty is not simply a one-time villain who disappeared after a single episode of Consequences. He is patient enough to spend years building toward real, lasting power, using an election rather than violence this time, showing a level of long-term planning that almost no other character on the show, including Rick himself, has ever demonstrated this clearly. It also raises the stakes of every question fans had already been asking about where this specific Morty came from, and why he seems to operate on an entirely different level of intelligence and patience than every other version of himself scattered across the multiverse. The show eventually gave fans something closer to a real answer, years after the theory had already taken hold across the fandom. In the Season 5 finale, an episode built almost entirely around Rick's long search for the specific version of himself responsible for killing the wife and daughter of his own original timeline, evil Morty returns for a final confrontation. Rather than fighting Rick directly, or attempting to seize even more power the way his earlier appearances might have predicted, evil Morty instead uses a device capable of breaking through the boundaries separating every universe where Rick is guaranteed to be the most intelligent and dangerous version of himself, stepping outside of it entirely and leaving that boundary behind forever. Before he leaves, the episode gives him a short, quiet monologue, one very different in tone from anything else the character has said across his previous appearances. He tells Rick in almost exhausted terms that he has spent his entire life being compared to every other Morty, competing for a kind of validation he eventually stopped wanting, and that the only way to escape that comparison completely was to leave the entire structure built around it far behind. He does not gloat, he does not threaten revenge, he simply chooses to disappear into unknown territory on his own terms, ending the story on a note of quiet exhaustion rather than triumphant villainy. This ending, while emotionally satisfying on its own, does not settle the question fans had been debating for years. The show still never confirms directly, in so many words, that this exact Morty is the exact Morty abandoned on a rock during the opening seconds of the pilot. What the finale does confirm is something almost as important to the theory. Evil Morty's entire motivation, across every appearance he makes, traces back to a deep personal exhaustion with being treated as replaceable, disposable, and endlessly compared against other versions of himself who all look and sound almost exactly the same. Whether or not the specific abandonment from the pilot is the exact origin of that exhaustion, the show confirms that some version of that exact wound sits underneath everything evil Morty has ever done, from the murders in the Council of Ricks to the political takeover of the entire Citadel years later. Fans who support the pilot connection point to something else worth sitting with carefully. Rick, across the entire run of the show, rarely, if ever, shows real guilt about leaving people behind when doing so becomes convenient. He abandons entire dimensions once they stop serving his needs. He treats death, both his own and other people's, with a level of detachment that unsettled even his family once they truly understood how far that detachment extends. If Rick really did abandon one specific Morty on a hostile planet as a child with no plan to return, it would fit an established pattern rather than standing out as some unusual exception. The disturbing part is not that Rick might have done this once. The disturbing part is how easily it fits everything else the show has already shown him doing without a second thought. There is also a structural reason this theory refuses to fade, separate from the visual evidence or the emotional logic connecting the two moments. Rick and Morty spends years building an entire society made up of countless versions of the same two characters, constantly asking its audience to wonder which specific version of Rick or Morty they are looking at during any given scene. Against that backdrop, the idea that one abandoned child from the very first scene of the entire series eventually grew up to become the single most dangerous and politically successful Morty in the multiverse feels less like a wild coincidence and more like the kind of long long, patient payoff this particular show has always specialized in delivering. A joke thrown away in the first 30 seconds of the pilot, revealed years later to be the origin point of one of the most important characters in the entire story. What makes this theory sit slightly apart from the two before it is the kind of fear it produces. The ticket theory raises questions about identity across an entire multiverse full of strangers. The idea of Rick replacing a version of himself raises questions about whether the people closest to him are living alongside someone they only think they know. This theory raises a smaller, sharper kind of fear, one aimed directly at a single decision made in a single moment, and the possibility that walking away from one child without looking back might have quietly created the most dangerous enemy Rick will ever face. Rick spends the entire series treating Morty as replaceable, one version interchangeable with the next, easily swapped out whenever convenience demands it. Evil Morty, under this theory, is not proof that Rick was wrong about that idea. He is proof of exactly how far wrong that idea can go once left alone long enough to grow into something patient, intelligent, and finally powerful enough to walk away from Rick entirely, on his own terms, without needing Rick's permission or approval ever again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same idea, a character quietly becoming something far more dangerous than anyone assumed while everyone else was busy underestimating him, sets up the next theory almost perfectly. Except this time, the fandom points the question in a direction nobody expected at all. Not toward a Morty hiding intelligence behind fear, toward a Rick everyone already assumes is a complete and total fool. Section 4. The Rick every other Rick calls an idiot. Every theory covered so far in this list builds its case around someone getting away with something quietly, using the multiverse itself as cover. Rick disappears into a stranger's family without anyone noticing. A young Morty hides real intelligence behind a convincing performance of fear. Both of those theories point toward characters using deception to gain something, whether that something is a stolen life or a stolen city. This next theory flips that pattern completely inside out. It asks whether one specific character has been using deception this entire time, not to gain power, but to avoid it, and whether the price he pays for that choice, constant mockery from everyone around him, might actually be the smartest decision anyone in the entire multiverse has ever made. That character shows up for only a few minutes of screen time across the whole series, in the same Season 1 finale that first introduced the Society of Ricks and the concept of an entire structure built to manage countless versions of the same man. Fans call him Doofus Rick, a name given to him almost immediately by every other Rick in the room the moment he walks into frame. He looks slightly different from the standard Rick design, a little softer around the edges, a little less sharp in his features, and within seconds of his introduction, the show makes clear exactly how the rest of Rick kind sees him. He is treated as an open joke, a punching bag, the one version of Rick that every other version feels comfortable openly mocking without any fear of consequences. The most infamous piece of mockery aimed at him involves a rumor, repeated by multiple other Ricks throughout the episode, claiming that he comes from a dimension where eating one's own waste is considered completely normal, and that he personally engages in this behavior without shame. The rumor spreads through the room the way playground gossip spreads through a schoolyard, other characters snickering, exchanging looks, treating Doofus Rick like something slightly less than a full member of their own species. At one point, two other Ricks even go out of their way to describe this rumor directly to Jerry, clearly hoping to disgust him or turn him against the one Rick who has, up to that point, treated him with more basic decency than any other Rick has shown him across the entire episode. The show never actually depicts Doofus Rick doing anything close to what the rumor accuses him of. He is never shown eating anything unusual. He never confirms the story himself. In fact, at one specific moment, when two Ricks bring the rumor up directly in front of him, Doofus Rick's reaction is not defensive anger or casual acceptance. He looks genuinely hurt, close to tears, clearly wounded by how easily the people around him repeat something that clearly is not true, simply because it gives them one more excuse to look down on him. That single reaction tells the audience something important about this character before anything else about him becomes clear. He feels things. He absorbs cruelty the way a normal person would, rather than deflecting it with the kind of cold detachment every other Rick in the room seems to specialize in. This detail matters enormously once placed next to everything else the show has already established about what a typical Rick is like. Every other version of Rick introduced across the series, including the one raising Morty in the main timeline, shares a specific cluster of traits: arrogance, emotional distance, a tendency to treat the people closest to them as tools first and family second. A willingness to abandon relationships the moment those relationships become inconvenient. Doofus Rick displays none of these traits. He gets his feelings hurt by playground-level gossip. He forms an immediate, genuine bond with Jerry, a character who spends the entire rest of the series being dismissed, ridiculed, and quietly resented by nearly everyone else around him, including his own father-in-law. Doofus Rick, within minutes of meeting Jerry for the first time, treats him with warmth, curiosity, and something close to respect, asking him real questions about his life and actually listening to the answers. Jerry's reaction to this treatment says almost as much about Doofus Rick as anything Doofus Rick does himself. Jerry, across the entire run of the show, rarely receives genuine kindness from anyone connected to Rick's side of the family. He absorbs insult after insult, dismissal after dismissal, treated by nearly every character close to him as an obstacle rather than a person. When Doofus Rick simply talks to him like an equal, asking about his career and responding with something resembling actual interest, Jerry visibly warms to him almost instantly, clearly starved for exactly this kind of basic respect. By the end of their short time together, Jerry has grown genuinely fond of him, defending him against the mockery of the other Ricks in the room, something Jerry almost never does for anyone across the entire series, let alone for someone he only just met. None of this, on its own, proves anything about intelligence. Kindness and intelligence are not the same thing, and the show does not explicitly state anywhere in this episode that Doofus Rick is secretly a genius hiding behind a convincing act. What it does show, quietly, in the background of a scene mostly focused on other plot points, is a single detail that fans eventually built an entire theory around. At one point during his short appearance, Doofus Rick casually mentions inventing something called ovenless brownies, a small piece of kitchen technology that allows brownies to bake without needing a traditional oven at all. The show treats this the same way it treats most of his dialogue, as a small, slightly odd joke buried inside a scene focused on bigger plot developments elsewhere. Fans, looking back at the scene later, treated it very differently. Inventing a genuinely new piece of technology, even something as small and silly as an ovenless baking method, requires a level of scientific understanding that a truly unintelligent character should not reasonably be capable of producing. This is where the theory really begins to take shape, built on a rule the show had already established just minutes earlier in the exact same episode. During the murder investigation that eventually leads to the discovery of evil Morty, one of the Ricks in the room explains, plainly and directly, why every functioning Rick throughout the multiverse keeps a Morty by his side at all times. A Morty's brain produces a kind of interference, one that scrambles the unusually powerful brain signals a Rick naturally gives off, making a Rick far harder to track, target, or predict by anyone hunting him. Without a Morty nearby, a Rick becomes exposed, easier to locate, and significantly more vulnerable to enemies who spend their lives hunting geniuses just like him. This single rule, delivered casually in the middle of an unrelated conversation, ends up becoming one of the most important pieces of evidence fans use to argue that Doofus Rick is nothing close to what everyone assumes he is. If keeping a Morty nearby exists specifically to protect a Rick whose intelligence would otherwise make him a target, then the simple fact that Doofus Rick still travels with his own Morty becomes strange under any interpretation where he is genuinely unintelligent. A Rick with nothing worth hiding, a Rick who poses no real threat to the kind of enemies who normally hunt down geniuses, would have very little reason to bother with the specific protection a Morty provides. Fans point to this detail directly, arguing that the presence of his own Morty, quiet and easy to overlook among everything else happening in the episode, is one of the strongest hints the show ever gives that Doofus Rick's stupidity is a performance rather than a genuine trait, something he maintains carefully rather than something that simply describes who he actually is. This idea gains even more weight once placed next to the specific kind of stupidity every other Rick in the room seems to believe about him. Nobody in the episode claims Doofus Rick is incapable of basic science, or incapable of understanding the technology every other Rick relies on. The mockery aimed at him focuses almost entirely on personal habits and social awkwardness. Things like the false rumor about his eating habits, his slightly softer, less confident way of speaking, and his general willingness to treat other people, even someone as widely dismissed as Jerry, with real warmth. Nobody ever directly challenges his scientific competence or points to a specific mistake he has made. The mockery is entirely about personality, not ability, a distinction the show never draws attention to directly, but one fans noticed almost immediately once they started rewatching the episode with this theory already in mind. Fans built out the rest of the theory by asking a simple question. If Doofus Rick really does possess a genuine, functioning level of Rick-tier intelligence, why would he ever choose to hide it behind an act this convincing? convincing, one thorough enough to fool every single other Rick in a room built specifically to identify and manage different versions of exactly this kind of person. The answer the theory settles on connects directly back to something the show has already shown, over and over, through the behavior of nearly every other Rick across the entire series. Intelligence in this specific universe comes paired almost automatically with a kind of isolation and cruelty that seems to damage everyone close to it. Rick C-137's own family carries visible scars from exactly this pattern. Beth spends years working through complicated feelings about a father who treated ambition and achievement as more important than presence and warmth. Summer grows up feeling invisible next to a grandfather who barely acknowledges her existence unless she happens to be useful to whatever plan he is currently running. Even Morty, the character Rick claims to care about more than almost anyone else, gets dragged into constant danger, manipulated, lied to, and occasionally abandoned entirely, whenever doing so becomes convenient. Doofus Rick, under this theory, looked at exactly this pattern, playing out across countless other versions of himself throughout the multiverse, and made a deliberate choice to avoid it entirely. Rather than embracing the arrogance and detachment that seems to come standard with real Rick-level intelligence, he chose to bury that intelligence behind a convincing performance of harmlessness, accepting mockery and disrespect from people he could probably outthink without much effort, specifically because that mockery comes with a benefit worth far more to him than respect ever could. Nobody expects anything from him. Nobody depends on him to solve dangerous problems, fight dangerous enemies, or lead any kind of dangerous mission. Nobody hunts him the way other geniuses get hunted, because nobody believes there is anything inside him worth hunting for in the first place. His stupidity, real or performed, functions as a kind of invisible shield, protecting him from the exact fate that seems to define every single other version of himself the show ever bothers to show in any real detail. This reading changes the entire emotional tone of his brief appearance once it settles into place. A scene that plays, on a first watch, as a simple joke about a dumber, softer version of Rick becomes something closer to a quiet tragedy once viewed through this lens. Here is a character who may have looked at the exact same intelligence every other Rick in the multiverse carries, weighed exactly what that intelligence tends to cost the people closest to it, and decided the cost was too high to pay. Rather than becoming another distant, self-destructive genius who damages every relationship he touches, he chose warmth instead, accepting humiliation as the price of keeping that warmth intact. Jerry's genuine affection for him by the end of the episode is not simply a cute character beat thrown in for a laugh. Under this theory, it becomes proof the strategy actually works. Doofus Rick manages, in a matter of minutes, to make a man feel more respected and more genuinely liked than most of that man's own family manages to make him feel across the entire rest of the series. There is also a quieter piece of evidence buried inside how the show frames his relationship with his own Morty specifically, one that fans point to less often, but which fits the theory just as cleanly. The version of Morty traveling with Doofus Rick appears calm and comfortable around him, showing none of the constant nervous tension that defines the relationship between Rick C-137 and his own Morty throughout the rest of the series. Every interaction between the two of them plays out with an easy familiarity, closer to genuine friendship than to the tense, unequal partnership Rick C-137 maintains with his grandson. If Doofus Rick really is hiding a fully functional Rick-level mind behind an act, this detail suggests something worth noticing about how that mind chooses to treat the one person genuinely dependent on him. Even hidden behind a costume of gentle stupidity, whatever intelligence exists underneath still produces a kinder, safer, more equal relationship than the intelligence Rick C-137 openly displays ever manages to produce with anyone. None of this reaches the level of confirmed fact, the way earlier theories on this list occasionally do. The show never directly states that Doofus Rick is hiding anything. He never breaks character within the episode, never drops the act in a private moment the way a normal reveal would typically require. Everything fans use to support this theory comes from small, quiet inconsistencies scattered across a handful of minutes of screen time, pieced together after the fact by an audience willing to rewatch a minor character's brief appearance dozens of times, looking for exactly this kind of pattern. That is precisely why it belongs on a list built around theories rather than a list built around settled plot points. The evidence is real, the conclusion drawn from that evidence remains, and will likely always remain, something the show leaves entirely up to its audience to decide for themselves. What keeps this specific theory alive, long after the episode that inspired it first aired, is how well it fits a much larger question the entire series keeps circling back to without ever fully answering. Rick and Morty spends years suggesting that Rick's specific combination of genius and cruelty comes as a package deal, something inseparable, a price every sufficiently intelligent version of this character apparently has to pay, no matter which dimension he happens to come from. Doofus Rick, whether the show intended this reading or not, offers a quiet counterexample sitting in the background of a single early episode, suggesting that maybe genius and cruelty were never actually inseparable at all. Maybe one specific version of Rick simply looked at the damage that combination causes across the rest of the multiverse and found a smarter way through, one that involved looking, sounding, and being treated exactly like a fool. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That idea, a character choosing to be underestimated on purpose because being underestimated keeps the people he cares about safe, connects directly to something the fandom eventually noticed running quietly underneath almost everything the show does, hidden far more literally than anyone originally expected. It has nothing to do with brainwaves or hidden costumes, and everything to do with a small, cold, sweet detail the show keeps returning to, again and again, at exactly the moments when something in this family is about to fall apart. Section 5. The frozen treat that might be the meaning of life. This next theory breaks that pattern completely. It is not built out of anything dark at all. It is built out of a dessert, and it might be the strangest, silliest, and somehow most emotionally honest theory the fandom has ever produced about what this entire show is actually trying to say. The theory is simple enough to state in one sentence, even though proving it takes a tour through nearly the entire run of the series. Rick and Morty keeps returning to ice cream again and again, at moments that matter far more than a simple dessert should ever matter. And fans eventually started asking whether the show is quietly using it as its own answer to one of the oldest questions any story can ask. What actually makes life worth living in a universe built on infinite copies of everyone, where nothing anyone does seems to carry any lasting weight? The trail starts early, in only the third episode the show ever aired, called Anatomy Park. On the surface, the episode is a loud, gross parody of a very famous dinosaur theme park movie. Except instead of dinosaurs, the attraction sits inside the body of one of Rick's old friends, a man named Ruben who is dying and does not know his insides have just become a tourist destination for tiny visitors. Rick sends Morty inside Ruben's body to help manage a growing disaster once several of the diseases living there begin attacking the miniature staff and guests. The episode escalates quickly into full-blown horror and chaos, with Morty trapped inside a dying man's body, while infections and parasites turn against everyone trapped there with him. In the middle of all that chaos, the show slows down just long enough to focus on one small character most casual viewers barely remember, an elderly amoeba named Dr. Xenon Bloom. One of the tiny residents living inside Ruben's body realizes there is no way out of what is coming. Ruben's body is failing, the danger inside is spreading, and death is close enough that running from it no longer makes sense. Rather than panic, Dr. Bloom does something the show frames with surprising gentleness for an episode this loud and violent everywhere else. He sits down calmly, pulls out a container of ice cream, and begins eating it slowly, choosing to spend his final moments enjoying something simple and sweet, rather than fighting a fight he already knows he cannot win. The scene lasts only a few seconds, and the show moves on quickly to the next disaster without dwelling on it. But fans who went back to study the episode years later noticed something worth sitting with directly. Out of every possible way to spend a final moment before death, the show chose ice cream specifically, framed as an act of real happiness rather than despair. Whatever true happiness and pleasure means to a character who knows the end has arrived, the show decided that meaning belonged to a bowl of ice cream, eaten slowly, without fear, while everything around him fell apart. That single choice, buried inside the third episode of a brand new series nobody expected to still be running years later, became the first piece of a pattern that would keep repeating itself long after most viewers had forgotten Anatomy Park even existed. The pattern shows up again just a handful of episodes later, though this next appearance carries a very different tone entirely. In an episode called Something Ricked This Way Comes, most of the story focuses on a mysterious shop owner who turns out to be the devil himself, tempting customers with cursed objects that ruin their lives in exchange for granting their wishes. Buried inside that larger plot is a much smaller, quieter subplot involving Summer and Rick, who spend part of the episode running a lemonade stand together while Morty and Beth deal with the devil's shop elsewhere in town. During that subplot, a local bully shows up and knocks a young child's ice cream cone straight out of his hand, ruining it and clearly enjoying the cruelty of the moment. Rather than letting it slide, Summer and Rick step in and physically confront confront the bully, standing up for a total stranger over something as small as a dropped dessert. On its own, this moment plays like a quick comedic aside, a chance for Summer and Rick to bond over a small act of decency in the middle of an episode otherwise focused on much bigger, darker stakes involving the literal devil. But once placed next to the ice cream theory as a whole, the scene reads differently. Out of every possible injustice the show could have chosen to make Rick and Summer angry enough to physically intervene, it chose the destruction of a child's ice cream cone specifically. In a show that regularly lets its characters watch genuinely horrifying things happen without much reaction at all, the writers picked this one small act of cruelty as the moment worth a real physical response. The pattern becomes even harder to dismiss once it reaches the second season, in an episode called A Rickle in Time. Beth and Jerry, dealing with tension in their marriage, decide to go out for ice cream together, treating it as a small, ordinary way to reconnect during a difficult stretch in their relationship. What starts as an ordinary outing turns into something far sillier once Jerry, overwhelmed with gratitude toward the ice cream shop for reasons the episode plays completely straight, ends up leaving an enormous tip, running his bill up into the hundreds of dollars almost entirely through over-tipping. The scene plays for laughs, framing Jerry's behavior as one more example of him being slightly ridiculous and easily overwhelmed by small pleasures. But it adds another entry to a growing list of moments where ice cream shows up specifically during a stretch of the story focused on whether this family can hold itself together at all. None of these individual scenes would mean much stacked up alone. A dying amoeba enjoying dessert, a grandfather and granddaughter defending a stranger's cone, a husband over-tipping at a creamery during a rocky patch in his marriage. Any one of these, taken by itself, is just a small joke, the kind of background detail a show fills its runtime with because somebody in the writer's room thought it would be funny. What turns this into something fans could not stop talking about is the moment ice cream shows up for the final time in the second season, in the episode that closes out the entire season, called The Wedding Squanchers. That episode ends with Rick's family in serious danger, having been discovered and targeted by the same intergalactic government that has hunted Rick for most of his life. Rather than let his family suffer the consequences of his own choices, Rick turns himself in, agreeing to surrender to the authorities in exchange for his family's safety. Before doing so, he has one last quiet conversation with Morty, the person he is closest to across the entire show. And rather than saying anything resembling a real goodbye, Rick tells Morty something strange and specific. He says he is going to a place called the Gloppy Drop system to get some ice cream, and that Morty should not wait up for him. Morty, and the audience along with him, understands almost immediately that this is not really about ice cream at all. Rick is leaving to surrender himself, likely for good, and rather than say that plainly, he hides the truth behind a small, strange lie about dessert. But the specific wording of what Rick says next is where the scene earns its place at the center of the entire theory. Rick tells Morty that if you go to where there is a bunch of ice cream, and then you never come back, you have not actually gotten any ice cream. You have simply gone to where ice cream is. That single line does something almost nobody expected from a joke about dessert. It turns ice cream into a stand-in for every good thing a person can chase without ever actually being allowed to enjoy it. Rick is not talking about dessert anymore. He is talking about happiness itself, about the difference between reaching a place where good things exist and actually being given the chance to sit down and experience them. Under this reading, Rick's entire goodbye becomes a quiet, coded confession. He knows he is walking toward captivity rather than comfort, toward a version of happiness he will likely never be allowed to actually taste, no matter how close he manages to get to it. Fans who built out the full theory point to one more moment worth adding to this list, one that happens earlier in the same season, after Rick survives a brutal, exhausting battle fought entirely inside a tiny universe he created himself, one built specifically to power his car using the endless labor of the tiny civilization living inside it. After barely surviving an uprising from that tiny universe's own scientists, exhausted and beaten, Rick tells Morty something short and simple about why any of it was worth doing at all. He says that ice cream is why they do what they do, treating the sentence less like a punchline and more like an actual answer to a question the show rarely lets its characters answer honestly. In a universe where Rick has access to nearly unlimited power, unlimited intelligence, and unlimited ways to reshape reality around him, the thing he names as the actual point of doing any of it is not power, not revenge, not even family in that specific moment. It is something as small, cheap, and ordinary as a scoop of dessert. Taken together, these scenes build a theory that fans eventually gave a full name to, treating it as something close to a unified answer for the entire entire show's underlying philosophy. Rick and Morty spends years asking, directly and indirectly, what actually makes life worth continuing inside a universe this large, this repetitive, and this indifferent to any single person's survival. Nihilism runs through nearly every corner of the show. Death gets treated casually. Identity gets treated as replaceable. Entire timelines get abandoned the moment they become inconvenient. Against that backdrop, ice cream becomes something like a small, sweet rebellion against everything else the show keeps insisting does not matter. It cannot be copied the way a person can be cloned. It cannot be undone the way a death can be reversed with the right machine. It exists only in the moment somebody actually sits down and eats it. And the show keeps circling back to that exact idea again and again at exactly the moments when its characters are facing death, heartbreak, or captivity. This is also why the theory refuses to feel silly once you actually sit with the pattern in full. A show willing to let a dying amoeba spend his final seconds enjoying dessert instead of panicking is a show making a specific, quiet argument about what death should actually look like when it finally arrives. A show willing to let Rick hide the true horror of surrendering himself behind a joke about ice cream is a show trusting its audience to hear the sadness underneath the joke without needing it spelled out directly. Ice cream, across all of these scenes, never gets treated as something silly or cheap by the show itself, even when the characters around it are being silly or cheap in nearly every other way. It gets treated, quietly and consistently, as the one thing in this entire multiverse simple enough and real enough to actually be worth wanting. There is a reason this theory lives so comfortably next to the darker ones already covered on this list, despite being built out of something as harmless as dessert. Every theory so far has asked some version of the same question. What is actually real, and what is simply a copy standing in for something that used to be real? The ticket theory asks this about entire episodes. The replacement theory asks this about Rick himself. The evil Morty theory asks this about a face the audience thought it already knew completely. Ice cream, strangely, becomes the show's one answer that never gets complicated by any of that uncertainty. A scoop of ice cream, eaten in the moment it is offered, cannot be faked, cannot be replaced by a clone, and cannot be quietly swapped out for a copy without anyone noticing the difference. In a universe this unstable, that might be exactly why the show keeps returning to it. It may be the only thing inside the entire show that is always, completely, and reliably exactly what it appears to be. None of this theory comes from a single confirmed statement by the show's creators explaining their intentions directly. Nobody involved in making Rick and Morty has ever stood up and said the whole series is secretly about ice cream, or that dessert was chosen deliberately as a symbol for happiness itself. What the theory rests on instead is a pattern, built entirely from scenes that actually aired, worded and framed in ways that repeat too consistently across too many different seasons to feel like pure coincidence. That is precisely why it belongs on this list rather than in a plot summary. The scenes are real. The dialogue is real. The specific choice to reach for ice cream during moments involving death, cruelty, marriage struggles, and devastating goodbyes is real. What that choice actually means, and whether the writers intended any of it as a unified statement about happiness in a meaningless universe, remains something only the audience gets to decide. What keeps the theory alive, more than anything else, is how well it fits the emotional truth sitting underneath a show that spends most of its time pretending not to have one. Rick and Morty hides its softest, most sincere ideas behind jokes constantly, the same way Rick hides his own sincerity behind sarcasm in nearly every conversation he has with the people who love him. A theory built entirely around dessert fits that pattern perfectly. It sounds like a joke on the surface. Underneath it, once the pattern is laid out fully, it might be one of the most honest things the show has ever said about what actually makes a short, chaotic, endlessly repeating life worth living anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same idea, something small and easy to laugh at, hiding something far more serious underneath it, carries directly into the next theory on this list. Except this time, the mystery is not about a dessert at all. It is about a woman the show has barely shown, a mother the audience has almost no information about, and a version of her currently living somewhere in space who might be more real than the one still sitting at the dinner table back home. Section 6. The mother who might not be the original. Every family member at the center of this show carries some kind of secret weight, but Beth carries hers differently than anyone else. She is the one character whose entire relationship with Rick gets treated with real seriousness across the show, rather than pure comedy. She is also, according to one of the strangest and most widely discussed theories in the entire fandom, possibly not even the same person she was several seasons ago, and possibly not the one the rest of of her family should actually be calling Mom. The theory begins with a quiet conversation buried inside an episode called The ABCs of Beth, which arrives during the third season and spends most of its runtime dealing with Beth's complicated feelings about her own childhood. Through flashbacks, the episode reveals that Beth grew up believing her father invented an entire imaginary world for her called Fruipyland, a magical, candy-colored place he claimed to have created just for her using his scientific tools. As an adult, Beth learns the truth. Fruipyland was real, built using actual technology, but Rick never intended it as a gift made purely out of love. He built it, at least in part, as a way to keep young Beth entertained and out of his way while he worked. And the fully imaginative, perfect childhood she believed she had was, underneath it, something closer to a very well-designed babysitting tool. This discovery forces Beth to sit with a question that has clearly followed her into adulthood without ever getting fully answered. She wonders whether she is anything like her father, someone capable of loving people while still being fundamentally selfish underneath that love, prioritizing his own freedom and his own curiosity over the people who depend on him. During this same episode, Rick offers Beth something he has never offered anyone else in the family. He tells her he could clone her, allowing one version of herself to leave home entirely and pursue the kind of adventurous, unrestricted life Rick himself has always lived, while a second version stays behind, keeps the family intact, and continues raising Summer and Morty without disruption. The episode ends before Beth gives a clear answer, leaving the choice unresolved for the audience. It takes until the fourth season finale, in an episode called Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, for the show to reveal what actually happened. Beth was cloned. One version of her left home and became known to the rest of the family and to fans as Space Beth, a hardened, capable warrior who spent her time fighting through the galaxy, freeing enslaved planets, and standing directly against the same intergalactic government that has hunted Rick for most of his life. The other version stayed behind, continuing the ordinary, domestic version of Beth's life that the show had followed from its very first episode. The twist that turns this into a genuine mystery, rather than a simple, clean split between two versions of the same woman, comes from what Rick does immediately after the cloning process finishes. According to his own account, delivered later through a recorded memory device the show calls a mind blower, Rick deliberately removed the labels from both cloning containers once the process was complete, then rotated their positions over and over, specifically so that even he would no longer know which container held the original Beth and which one held the copy. He then allowed the two versions to go their separate ways without either of them, or anyone else in the family, ever learning the truth. This detail is what makes the mystery genuinely unsolvable, rather than simply unresolved. In most stories involving clones, someone eventually knows the real answer, even if the characters on screen do not. Here, the show establishes directly that the one person capable of knowing the truth deliberately destroyed his own ability to know it. Rick did not lose track of which Beth was which by accident. He erased the distinction on purpose, choosing permanent uncertainty over an answer he apparently did not want to carry the responsibility of holding. Both versions of Beth eventually learn that one of them is a clone, discovering matching implants in their necks that confirm the cloning definitely happened, even though the implants themselves offer no way to determine which version is the original. Rather than treating this as a problem that needs solving, both versions ultimately decide, together, that they would rather not know. They choose to move forward treating each other as equally real, equally valid versions of the same woman, refusing to let one of them be quietly demoted to the status of copy, simply because a definite answer would technically exist somewhere if either of them pushed hard enough to find it. This choice, made by the characters themselves within the show, is exactly what fans have refused to leave alone. The show settled the emotional question. Both Beths agreed to stop caring which one is real. Fans, however, kept caring anyway, treating the unresolved mystery as one of the most interesting open questions the entire series has ever left on the table, and building detailed arguments in both directions using nothing but small clues scattered across several different episodes. The argument in favor of Space Beth being the original leans heavily on something Beth says directly, before the cloning even happens, during her earlier conversation with Rick. She tells him plainly that she wants to know what she is capable of beyond the life she has always lived, admitting that watching Rick's freedom and adventure across the years has left her wondering what kind of life she might have built for herself if she had ever been given the same kind of chance. Space Beth's entire arc, once she appears, lines up almost perfectly with that specific wish. She becomes exactly the kind of capable, adventurous, battle-hardened person Beth admitted she sometimes wished she could be. Fans point to this alignment as evidence that the original Beth, given the chance to finally live out that specific fantasy, would naturally be the one who ended up living it, while a newly made handmade copy took her place at home instead. The argument on the other side leans on something quieter, buried in how the home version of Beth behaves once the split has already happened. Fans supporting this reading argue that Rick, aware of exactly how much damage his own absence caused Beth throughout her childhood, may have deliberately built the version who stayed behind with a stronger natural pull toward home and family, specifically so that staying would never feel like a sacrifice to her. Under this reading, the domestic Beth's continued devotion to her family is not proof that she is the original. It is proof that Rick engineered a version of his daughter capable of finding genuine peace in exactly the kind of ordinary life the real Beth might have secretly wanted to escape. Neither argument can be confirmed using anything the show has actually stated outright, and that lack of confirmation is precisely the point. Rick did not almost lose track of which Beth was which. He removed the labels and swapped their positions on purpose, according to his own recorded account, meaning the show is not hiding an answer from its audience the way it sometimes hides other mysteries that eventually get explained. It appears to have removed the answer entirely, embedding uncertainty directly into the story instead of simply delaying a reveal for later. This distinction matters enormously once placed next to everything else this list has already covered. The evil Morty mystery eventually received a clear confirmation once the show revealed the same face returning years apart. The burial scene at the end of season 1 is stated directly by the characters, leaving no real ambiguity about what happened. Beth's situation works differently. It is the rare mystery inside this show that was built specifically to never be solved. Not because the writers have not gotten around to it yet, but because the entire emotional point of the storyline depends on nobody ever being allowed a clean answer. That choice reshapes how fans read nearly every scene involving either version of Beth that has aired since the split happened. Every warm family dinner scene involving the Beth who stayed home carries a quiet question underneath it now, one the show will likely never answer directly. Every time Space Beth returns to visit, fighting alongside her family before disappearing back into space, that same question follows her too. Fans have started referring to both women as equally real, specifically because the alternative, treating one of them as a lesser copy without any actual proof to support that judgment, would require choosing an answer the show itself has gone out of its way to make impossible to choose correctly. There is also something worth noticing in how calmly the show handles all of this, especially compared to how it has handled ambiguity elsewhere. When evil Morty's identity remained unclear, the show used it as a source of dread, letting the mystery build tension over multiple seasons before finally paying it off directly. The Beth mystery gets almost the opposite treatment. Once the reveal happens and both women learn what occurred, the show moves on almost immediately, letting the two Beths settle into an easy, supportive relationship with each other, rather than turning their shared uncertainty into a source of ongoing conflict. That calm reaction, coming from two characters who have every reason to obsess over which one of them is real, stands in sharp contrast to how seriously the fandom continues to treat the exact same question years later. Fans point to this gap between how little the characters care and how much the audience cares as one of the more interesting side effects of the entire storyline. The show appears to be making a specific argument through Beth and her clone, suggesting that the difference between an original and a copy might matter far less than people assume, so long as both versions are allowed to live real, meaningful lives once they exist. The audience, conditioned by years of stories built around clones needing to be exposed, replaced, or judged as lesser, has a much harder time accepting that same argument at face value, which is exactly why the theory refuses to settle down and disappear the way the show itself clearly wants it to. What makes this specific mystery worth placing near the end of a list built around insane theories is how differently it behaves compared to nearly everything discussed earlier. Every other theory on this list eventually points toward a hidden truth waiting somewhere to be uncovered, something the characters either already know or could eventually learn if the right piece of evidence surfaced. Beth's situation offers no hidden truth to uncover at all. Rick did not fail to keep track of the labels. He erased them on purpose and then admitted doing so, on the record, inside his own memory. The mystery is not a secret waiting for someone clever enough to solve it. It is a deliberate gap the show built directly into its own story. One final piece of uncertainty sitting quietly at the center of the show's most emotionally serious family relationship, left there permanently and completely on purpose. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to build a mystery with no real answer at all leads directly into the strangest entry on this this entire list, one with even less evidence behind it than anything covered so far. Built almost entirely out of a single detail belonging to a woman the show has barely bothered to show at all. Section 7. The Vanished Wife and Her Impossible Double. Diane Sanchez is one of the most important characters in the entire history of Rick and Morty, and also one of the least present. She is Rick's wife and Beth's mother, and her death sits underneath nearly every major decision Rick makes across the whole series. Despite that weight, the show has given her almost nothing in the way of an actual identity. A handful of flashbacks, a few second-hand mentions, no real personality of her own beyond what Rick's grief allows the audience to see. That silence is exactly what let one of the strangest guesses in the entire fandom take root. The show establishes clearly that Diane and a young Beth were killed by a bomb, an event that shapes years of Rick's behavior, including his long, obsessive hunt for the specific version of himself responsible. That figure is eventually named directly as Rick Prime, a cold, calculating alternate Rick who offered the original C-137 Rick working portal technology at the very start of his career. When that offer was turned down, Rick Prime responded not with simple disappointment, but with total destruction, sending an explosive device into Rick's own home and killing both Diane and Beth in the blast. Rick survived, badly wounded, and rather than grieving quietly, spent the following decades building his own portal technology from scratch, using it to search across the entire multiverse for the exact version of himself who had done this to his family. For most of the show's run, that search remains mostly background noise, referenced only occasionally and never explained in full detail. What eventually surfaces several seasons later is far darker than most fans originally guessed. Rick Prime did not simply kill one version of Diane in one unlucky dimension. He hunted down other versions of Rick who had also rejected his offer, killing their versions of Diane as well, until he eventually built a device capable of something far more permanent than a single act of violence. That device, referred to by some Ricks as the Omega device, does not simply end a life. It erases a person completely, wiping them from every single dimension across the entire multiverse at once, along with much of the surrounding memory of that person ever having existed at all. Rick Prime used exactly this device on Diane, meaning that unlike almost every other character in the show, there is no alternate version of her running around anywhere else in the multiverse to be discovered later, cloned, or mistaken for someone else. She is gone completely, in every reality, all at the same time. This single detail answers something fans had quietly wondered about for years without ever getting a clear explanation. Nearly every other character across this show eventually turns up in multiple forms somewhere else in the multiverse. Alternate Ricks fill an entire council. Alternate Beths get split into two through cloning. Alternate Jerrys fill up an entire daycare center. Diane never appears anywhere in any of these crowds, not even in the background of a scene. And the reason turns out to be built directly into the plot rather than being an oversight. She was deliberately removed from existence at a scale far beyond a single death, which is also why Rick's grief over her never fades the way grief eventually fades for most people. He cannot simply meet a different version of her the way he might meet a different version of almost anyone else. The option to replace her, quietly available to him for nearly every other loss in his life, was taken away on purpose. The show adds another layer to this grief that goes beyond memory alone. At some point after Diane's death, Rick built an artificial version of her, a kind of voice recreated using technology, one that lived inside his old house and called out to him from another room, sounding almost exactly like she used to sound while she was alive. Rather than offering comfort, this artificial voice mostly served as a constant reminder of what he had lost and why, repeatedly pushing him back toward his hunt for revenge whenever he showed any sign of moving on. Years later, after briefly returning to that same house, Rick tells this artificial voice directly that he intends to let go of the pursuit, having built a new life and a new bond with a different family in a different dimension entirely. The artificial voice does not simply accept this. It reasons through the situation carefully, pointing out that if certain recent events had reset Rick's own location, the same events likely reset Rick Prime as well, meaning the man responsible for everything might now be reachable again for the first time in years. That single piece of reasoning very nearly pulls Rick back into his old obsession completely, and only a conversation with Morty manages to talk him down from it. This detail matters because it shows how carefully the show treats Diane's absence, rather than simply forgetting about her once the mystery had already served its early purpose. Even a recreated, artificial version of her voice still manages to shape major decisions Rick makes years after her death, proving that her influence over the story never actually stopped, even even during long stretches where her name barely gets mentioned at all. There's also a detail worth adding about how strongly Rick reacts whenever anyone outside his immediate circle tries to speak about Diane with any confidence. In one particular dinner scene, a powerful figure named Mr. Nimbus, who has crossed paths with Rick before, casually brings her up in conversation, clearly assuming this is safe, ordinary small talk between two men who know each other's history. Rick reacts with immediate anger, cutting him off and accusing him of trying to nail down a fixed version of events that Rick has never allowed anyone to fully pin down. The reaction feels disproportionate to the moment itself, a small comment met with real hostility, and it says something important about how tightly Rick still controls every piece of information connected to her, refusing to let anyone else claim ownership over even a small part of that story. That same instinct to control the narrative around Diane runs directly through the flashback fans have spent years arguing about, the one shown during the episode Rick Shank Redemption. When Rick tells his interrogators exactly how he met Diane and how their relationship began, framing it as a warm, believable origin story, he later insists the entire flashback was invented specifically to mislead them. For a long stretch of the show's run, fans took this denial at face value, assuming the whole scene had been fabricated from nothing, meaning nothing shown in it could be trusted as real. Later episodes complicate that assumption directly. Once the show finally lays out the full, confirmed version of Rick's backstory, involving Rick Prime's offer, Diane and Beth's deaths, and the decades of hunting that followed, it becomes clear that most of the original flashback was actually true. Diane really did exist the way she was shown. The relationship really did begin close to the way it was described. The one piece Rick actually invented, tucked inside a story that was otherwise mostly honest, was a specific detail about exactly how he first figured out the science behind portal travel. A technical detail he clearly did not want a room full of hostile strangers getting their hands on. This changes the shape of the mystery considerably. Rick was not lying about Diane at all. He was hiding one small, dangerous piece of information by wrapping it inside a much larger, mostly true story about the woman he loved, betting correctly that nobody questioning him would think to separate the real parts of the story from the one part that mattered strategically. Fans who spent years assuming the entire scene was fake were, in a strange way, exactly as misled as the characters Rick was originally lying to inside the story itself. With so little additional information available beyond these scattered, carefully guarded pieces, a much stranger theory started circulating anyway, built from something that has nothing to do with any of this confirmed backstory at all. The idea suggests that Diane is secretly Miss Frizzle, the eccentric, brightly dressed teacher from a completely unrelated children's show about a magical school bus that shrinks, flies, and travels to impossible places to teach science lessons. The entire theory rests on a single piece of evidence, and it is a small one. Summer, Beth's daughter and Diane's granddaughter, has bright red hair, a shade that happens to closely resemble the hair color most associated with the animated teacher from that other show. That is the whole case. No dialogue supports it, no visual reference inside Rick and Morty ever points toward the other show directly. No writer involved in either production has ever suggested any connection exists between the two characters, and the show's own confirmed design for Diane describes her with light blonde hair rather than red, making the physical comparison even weaker once actually checked against the character's official appearance. The theory survives purely because Diane remains such an empty space in the story for so many years that fans filled that space with something absurd, almost as a joke about how little the show originally bothered to give them. What makes this theory worth taking seriously anyway, despite having almost nothing real behind it, is what it reveals about how audiences respond to a story that deliberately withholds information for as long as this one did. Rick and Morty is a show willing to explain, in exhausting detail, how portal guns work, how cloning tanks function, and how an entire government manages countless versions of the same two characters across a functioning society. For years, against all of that explanation, the show gave Diane almost no real voice of her own, and fans noticed that gap immediately. The Miss Frizzle guess is not really an attempt to solve a mystery. It is a pointed joke, built by fans who noticed exactly how little material they had been given and decided to fill the silence with the most ridiculous possible answer rather than a serious one. Fans reacted to that long silence in two very different ways, long before the later seasons finally filled in most of the real story. Some tried to fill the gap with genuine emotional speculation, imagining a Diane who might have been just as sharp, just as complicated, and just as capable of standing up to to Rick as any other character close to him. Guesses that turned out to line up reasonably well with the loving, grounded woman later flashbacks eventually confirmed. Others, faced with the same empty space, filled it instead with something completely absurd, borrowing a character from an entirely different show simply because the resemblance in hair color gave them an excuse to make the joke. Both reactions come from the exact same source. A character this important to the emotional foundation of the entire series had been given almost no real presence of her own for years, and fans, unwilling to simply accept that silence, filled it however they could, whether that meant careful guesswork or a deliberately ridiculous joke about a teacher from a children's cartoon. This particular guess says less about the show itself and more about how far an audience is willing to go once a story leaves a large enough gap unfilled for long enough. Diane's story eventually stopped being a puzzle with no real pieces at all. Once the show finally explained Rick Prime, the Omega device, and the true reason no other version of her has ever appeared anywhere else in the multiverse. For years before that explanation arrived, though, it was mostly a blank space, and fans built an answer purely out of that absence, using nothing more than the color of a granddaughter's hair. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to fill a blank space with something ridiculous on the surface, yet still spreading across an entire fandom anyway, carries directly into the final theory on this list. That last one is not built from a missing detail at all. It is built from a train, 8 cars long, and a joke about storytelling that fans turned into a countdown for exactly how many years the show had left to run. Section 8. The train that might have predicted the show's own ending. Rick and Morty rarely explains its own writing process on screen, but one episode breaks that rule completely, and fans turn the results into a countdown clock for the entire series. The episode is called Never Ricking Morty, and it aired as the Season 4 mid-season premiere, arriving after a stretch of episodes that had mostly kept to the show's usual mix of standalone adventures and quiet lore drops. It stands apart from almost everything else the show has ever made. Rather than following a normal adventure, it takes place almost entirely aboard a mysterious, endless train, one that runs on story itself rather than fuel. The villain running that train calls himself the Story Lord, and his entire purpose is built around forcing Rick and Morty into repeating familiar patterns from their own past adventures, feeding those patterns into the train's engine to keep it moving forward. His name itself is built as a play on the word storyboard, a small joke buried inside the character's identity that fans only noticed after sitting with the episode for a while. Visually, he is drawn to closely resemble Dan Harmon himself, sharing a similar beard and a similar hairstyle, a detail the show does not draw attention to directly, but which becomes obvious once someone points it out. Scene after scene, the episode pulls out moments and character types that feel instantly familiar to longtime viewers, versions of fights, jokes, and setups the show has used many times before, except now they are shown explicitly as fuel for a machine rather than as fresh storytelling. Rick, who almost never admits weakness of any kind, spends the episode visibly furious about being trapped inside something built entirely from recycled versions of his own life, refusing to accept that his story can be reduced to a formula running on rails. At one point during the episode, Rick and Morty find themselves inside a car built to look like an ordinary classroom, surrounded by students and a teacher who have no idea they do not belong there. After taking control of the room, Rick searches through the teacher's desk and pulls out a diagram labeled Anthology, showing a circle divided cleanly into 8 separate segments. This diagram is not a random prop. It is a direct visual reference to something the show's own co-creator has talked about publicly for years, a writing method he calls the story circle, one he built by adapting a much older idea from a writer named Joseph Campbell, who spent decades studying how myths and hero stories tend to repeat the same basic shape across almost every culture in the world. The 8 steps making up this story circle are laid out clearly enough that fans could map them directly onto the episode once they started looking. A character begins in a zone of comfort, familiar and safe. That character wants something badly enough to leave that comfort behind. They enter an unfamiliar situation in pursuit of it. They adapt to that new, unfamiliar world. They get the thing they wanted. They pay a heavy, often painful price for getting it. They return to the familiar situation they started in. Finally, they arrive back changed, carrying something from the journey that did not exist in them before it began. Harmon has used this exact structure across nearly everything he has written, not just Rick and Morty, but his earlier show Community as well, treating it less less like a suggestion and more like a working blueprint he returns to almost every time he sits down to build a new episode. Never-ricking Morty takes this blueprint, normally kept invisible behind the scenes, and turns it into an actual physical structure the characters have to fight their way through. Each car on the train works as a stand-in for a different stage of that 8-step journey, forcing Rick and Morty to physically move from car to car the same way a script would normally move a character from one story beat to the next. A fight against an enormously strong ticket collector represents the unfamiliar situation stage, a moment where Morty has to tell a completely unrelated story about Summer and Beth fighting off scorpions using an invented weapon becomes the specific price they have to pay in order to keep moving forward. A scene the show plays partly as a joke about how strangely specific certain rules of storytelling can get once you actually try to follow them literally. Eventually, after fighting through enough of these forced story beats, Rick and Morty reach the engine room and come face to face with the story lord directly, treating the confrontation the same way any other episode might treat a final boss fight, except this one openly acknowledges that it is functioning as exactly that. The ending of the episode adds one more layer that some fans initially missed on a first watch. After defeating the story lord and sealing him inside the story he tried to trap them in, Rick reaches for the train's controls to try shutting the whole thing down properly. Rather than functioning like real machinery, the controls simply snap off in his hand, revealing that the entire train, despite everything it just put both characters through, was never a real, physical object at all. The scene cuts immediately to Rick and Morty standing in the Smith family living room, looking down at a small, glowing toy train moving in a slow circle on the floor. One Morty explains he bought for Rick at a shop back on the Citadel. What felt, moment to moment, like a life-threatening ordeal spanning multiple locations and multiple dangerous enemies gets revealed in the space of a single cut to have been nothing more than an oddly detailed daydream inspired by a toy. This ending matters beyond simply being a clever twist. It means the entire episode, structurally, ends up completing the exact 8-step journey it spent its runtime openly discussing. Rick and Morty start the episode in ordinary comfort, get pulled into an unfamiliar, dangerous situation, adapt to it, fight through it, and return to the same living room they started in, having gained nothing tangible except the experience itself. The show is not simply talking about its own formula from a safe distance. It is completing that exact formula in real time, inside the very episode built to point it out. The number 8, once it appears this clearly and this deliberately inside the episode's own visual design, became the seed for the exact theory this section is built around. Fans studying the episode noticed that 8 train cars line up precisely with the 8 steps of Harmon's story circle, and began asking whether the number might be pointing towards something bigger than the episode itself. If 8 train cars represent 8 chapters of a single story, some fans reasoned, the number itself might be quietly describing how many total seasons the show was always planned to run before reaching its own true ending. Some fans went even further than simply counting train cars, digging directly into the episode's own animation for hidden confirmation. During the scene where the train's broken controls fall apart in Rick's hands, a brief shot reveals a string of numbers printed inside the mechanism itself, reading 02376319. Fans studying this sequence noticed it lines up imperfectly but noticeably with specific steps from both the story circle and the older hero's journey structure it was originally adapted from, treating the numbers as a kind of buried key, confirming that the entire episode was built with mathematical precision around these two storytelling frameworks. Whether or not the animators intended this sequence as a genuine puzzle for viewers to solve, its presence added weight to the idea that nothing about this specific episode, right down to a few numbers glimpsed for less than a second, was accidental. At the time this theory first spread across the fandom, the show had released only a handful of seasons, meaning the 8-car theory suggested there were still several more seasons left to come before the series would reach whatever ending its creators originally had in mind. Fans treated the number almost like a hidden countdown, something the writers had slipped into the show's own visuals without ever announcing it directly, giving longtime viewers a rough sense of how much story was actually left before the credits rolled for the final time. This kind of theory sits in a very different category from something like the buried bodies scene from season 1, which the show confirms directly through dialogue, or the returning face of evil Morty, which the show eventually confirms through a clear visual reveal years later. The train car theory works differently. It is built entirely on a number, chosen for a specific visual design inside one unusual episode, interpreted by fans as a secret message about the show's own future, rather than as a simple creative choice made to fit that episode's own internal logic. Nothing in the episode itself itself states directly that each car represents one season of the show. The connection exists purely because fans noticed a number that felt meaningful and decided to test what happens if you take it completely literally. That is exactly what makes this theory worth including here, rather than treating it as a serious piece of confirmed information. It shows just how far a fandom is willing to reach once a show gives them even one small, specific number to hold on to. An 8-car train, built as a visual metaphor for a well-known screenwriting structure, became a prediction about release schedules and season counts almost overnight, spreading across forums and video essays long after the episode itself had been mostly forgotten by casual viewers. The show never confirmed this reading, and nothing about the episode's actual content requires viewers to take the number as anything more than a stylistic choice fitting the story being told in that specific hour of television. The show eventually returned to the Storylord character years later in an episode called Full Meta Jackrick, offering one more small piece of context that fans folded directly into their ongoing discussion of the character's meaning. That later episode reveals the story train was originally built and sold as a piece of merchandise, manufactured by a company existing inside the show's own fictional universe, meaning the toy sitting in the Smith family living room was never simply a throwaway detail. It was presented as a real, purchasable object with its own manufacturing history, one now tied directly to a writer character named Jan, shown living in poor conditions and clearly meant as a stand-in for the pressures placed on a real writer trying to meet the demands of an audience that always wants more story than can comfortably be produced. Storylord, once revealed to be that writer's own creation, turning against the very audience he was built to entertain, adds a layer of real, grounded frustration underneath an episode that otherwise plays almost entirely as absurdist comedy. What keeps this theory interesting anyway, regardless of whether the number ever lines up with anything real, is what it reveals about how deeply this particular fandom studies even the smallest visual details the show puts on screen. Rick and Morty rarely wastes a background detail completely. Ticket numbers matter. Cloning tank labels matter. A single line about ice cream, delivered quickly during an emotional goodbye, carries enough weight to build an entire theory of its own. Against that history, treating 8 train cars and a barely visible string of numbers hidden inside a broken toy lever as something worth counting carefully does not feel unreasonable, even if the specific prediction built from that number never turns out to match anything the show actually intended. The episode itself ends with Rick successfully breaking free from the Storylord's control, refusing to let his own life be reduced permanently to a repeating formula, even while openly admitting that formulas and patterns exist underneath nearly everything he does. That ending fits neatly alongside the show's larger relationship with its own structure. Rick and Morty spends years poking fun at typical storytelling rules, breaking them constantly, mocking predictable plots whenever the opportunity arises, while still following many of those same rules quietly in the background of nearly every episode it makes. Never Ricking Morty is simply the one time the show admits this directly, and the train car theory is the fandom's way of pushing that admission just one step further than the episode itself ever intended to go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The train car theory shows how far this fandom will go once a show hands it even one specific number to chase. The next theory does not come from a number at all, and it does not stay confined to a single episode either. It comes from a shape, one repeated so often across the show that some fans stopped calling it a coincidence and started calling it the whole point. Section 9. The two halves of a single broken mind. Long before science understood how the human brain actually works, a researcher named Julian Jaynes put forward a strange idea back in the 1970s. He suggested that ancient humans may not have experienced their own thoughts the way people do today. Instead of feeling like one single mind making decisions, early humans might have experienced their thinking as two separate parts working together. One part gave commands, almost like a voice speaking from somewhere else. The other part simply obeyed those commands, turning them into real action without questioning where they came from. Jaynes argued that this split eventually faded as humans developed the kind of self-awareness people rely on now, where a person feels like a single, unified mind, rather than two separate voices working as a team. This idea sat quietly inside psychology books for decades, mostly discussed by researchers and rarely mentioned anywhere close to a cartoon about a drunk scientist and his grandson. Then, a small group of fans looked at Rick and Morty and noticed something that felt strangely familiar. Rick barks out plans, insults, and instructions constantly, rarely pausing to explain himself fully before expecting immediate action. Morty, again and again, simply does what he is told, stumbling through danger without ever fully understanding the plan, acting first and understanding later, if he understands at all. Fans studying this pattern began asking a question that sounds almost too strange to take seriously at first. What if Rick and Morty are not actually two separate people at all? What if they represent one single mind, split into two working halves, with Rick acting as the part that decides, and Morty acting as the part that simply carries those decisions out into the world? The theory earns its place near the end of this list precisely because it cannot be proven using a single scene or a single piece of dialogue the way some of the earlier theories on this list can. It survives entirely on pattern and behavior, stacked carefully across years of episodes, built by fans willing to treat small production details as meaningful clues rather than simple coincidence. The first piece of evidence fans point to is not something written into the story at all. It is a real, confirmed fact about how the show was actually made behind the scenes. For years, both Rick and Morty were voiced by the exact same person, Justin Roiland, who performed both characters himself using two very different voices. This means every single conversation between Rick and Morty across the earlier seasons of the show was technically one man talking to himself, switching voices back and forth in real time to create the illusion of two separate people having a discussion. On its own, this fact does not prove anything about the story itself. Plenty of shows use one performer to voice multiple characters purely for practical reasons, without intending any deeper meaning behind the choice. But once fans noticed how naturally this detail lines up with the split mind idea, it became one of the most repeated pieces of evidence used to support the theory. A single voice, splitting itself into two distinct characters who spend nearly every episode arguing, planning, and reacting to each other, mirrors the exact structure Janes described decades earlier. One voice commanding, one voice carrying out the command, both technically coming from the exact same source the entire time. The second piece of evidence fans point to involves the physical design of Rick's spaceship, the vehicle the two of them use constantly throughout the show to travel between dimensions and planets. Fans studying the design of this ship notice that its shape closely resembles a human brain, curved and rounded in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental once someone points it out directly. The show has never confirmed this resemblance as a deliberate design choice made specifically to support any deeper meaning, and no episode ever draws attention to the shape directly through dialogue. It remains a visual observation made by fans studying the show closely, rather than something the writers or animators have publicly explained. Even without direct confirmation, the shape keeps showing up in fan discussions as one more small piece supporting the larger picture. A ship shaped like the very thing the show may be quietly suggesting the two main characters actually represent together. The strongest piece of evidence supporting this theory, however, comes directly from something the show does explain clearly, stated as an actual working rule of how Rick's own biology functions. During the investigation that eventually reveals Evil Morty's identity, one of the many Ricks gathered together explains plainly why every functioning Rick throughout the multiverse keeps a Morty close by at nearly all times. A Rick's brain produces an unusually powerful signal, one strong enough to be tracked and targeted by anyone hunting for exceptional intelligence. A Morty's brain, weaker and much more common throughout the universe, produces a kind of static that interferes with that signal, making a Rick significantly harder to detect and target as long as a Morty stays physically close to him. This single rule turns Morty into something far stranger than a simple sidekick or companion once you sit with it directly. Morty is not just useful to Rick emotionally, as a source of company or family connection. Morty is functionally necessary to Rick's own safety at a biological level, acting almost like a second half of a single working system rather than an independent person choosing to tag along out of loyalty or fear. Without Morty nearby, Rick becomes exposed and vulnerable in a very literal, measurable way. With Morty nearby, Rick becomes protected, harder to find, and better equipped to survive in a universe full of enemies specifically hunting minds like his. Fans point directly to this rule as proof that the show itself, whether intentionally or not, has already established that Rick and Morty function biologically like two connected pieces of one larger, more complete system, rather than two fully separate individuals who simply happen to travel together. Once this rule is accepted as true, the emotional side of the theory becomes much easier to build out. Rick, across nearly every season of the show, struggles constantly with real isolation, real emotional collapse, and real moments where his own mind seems to work against him. He drinks heavily, he self-medicates constantly. In one especially dark scene from an episode called Autoerotic Assimilation, discussed earlier in this list, he sits alone with a weapon pointed directly at his own head, only surviving that moment because he passes out before doing anything permanent. In another especially revealing scene, during the episode Pickle Rick, an actual professional therapist manages to see through every single one of Rick's usual defenses within minutes, delivering a calm, accurate description of exactly what drives his self-destructive behavior. Something Rick himself, despite his genius, has apparently never been able to fully articulate on his own. Fans supporting the split mind theory argue that these moments make far more sense once Rick is understood as only one half of a complete system, rather than a fully whole person operating entirely on his own. A mind built to command constantly, without ever pausing to physically carry anything out himself, might naturally struggle with stillness, with silence, and with any moment that forces it to sit alone with its own thoughts, rather than immediately directing action outward into the world. Rick rarely, if ever, seems comfortable simply existing quietly. He needs motion, danger, and constant problems to solve. Under this theory, that restlessness is not just a personality quirk shaped by trauma, it is what happens when the commanding half of a single mind is separated, even briefly, from the acting half it was always meant to work alongside. Morty, under the same theory, represents the opposite kind of imbalance. Where Rick commands constantly without ever being told what to do by anyone else, Morty spends nearly the entire series being told what to do, rarely given the chance to make his own major decisions without Rick's voice guiding him first. Morty stumbles, panics, and reacts constantly throughout nearly every episode, carrying out Rick's plans with far less confidence and far less understanding of the reasoning behind them. Fans argue that this dynamic mirrors the second half of Janes's original idea almost perfectly, describing a mind capable of action without ever fully understanding the reasoning driving that action, relying entirely on an outside voice to provide the direction it cannot generate for itself. The theory becomes even more interesting once placed next to specific moments where Morty briefly breaks from this pattern and makes a major decision entirely on his own, without waiting for Rick's direction first. These moments stand out sharply precisely because they happen so rarely across the show. When Morty does act independently, the results tend to be significant, sometimes even more dramatic or consequential than anything Rick himself might have chosen to do in the same situation. Fans point to these rare moments as evidence that the acting half of this system is not actually incapable of independent thought. It has simply been trained across years of habit and repetition to wait for outside direction, rather than generate its own. The same way Janes originally suggested ancient humans slowly learn to generate their own inner voice, rather than waiting for an outside command to guide every single action. None of this theory requires viewers to believe the show is literally suggesting Rick and Morty share one physical brain in some kind of scientific, verifiable sense. Nothing in the actual plot of the show supports that reading directly, and no character ever states anything close to this idea in dialogue. What the theory offers instead is a way of understanding the emotional core of the entire relationship between these two characters, one built on real, confirmed facts about how the show works, stacked carefully alongside a real psychological idea borrowed from outside the show entirely. Rick genuinely does need Morty nearby for his own physical safety, according to rules the show itself established directly. Rick genuinely does struggle to function normally without someone nearby to anchor him, based on behavior the show has demonstrated repeatedly across multiple seasons. Whether or not the writers ever intended any of this as a deliberate metaphor for a single divided mind, the pieces fit together closely enough that the theory continues circulating years after it first appeared, discussed and rediscussed by fans who keep finding new small details that seem to support it further. There is something quietly sad sitting underneath this theory once it settles into place, separate from anything overtly dramatic or shocking. If Rick and Morty really do represent two halves of one larger, incomplete system, then neither of them can ever really become whole without the other, no matter how much either one might want independence at different points throughout the story. Rick's occasional attempts to push Morty away, to protect him by keeping him at a distance during especially dangerous situations, become even more painful under this reading. He is not simply trying to protect a grandson he loves. He may be trying, and consistently failing, to survive as only half of what he actually needs to function at all. Morty's own repeated attempts to break away from Rick, to build an ordinary life with Jessica, or to simply stop being dragged along on dangerous adventures, take on a similar weight. He is not just a teenager wanting normal freedom. He may be the acting half of a system, trying to prove it can generate its own direction, even while every rule the show has established suggests that direction was never meant to exist fully apart from the voice giving the original operational command. This theory closes out the emotional side of this list in a very different place than where the list began. The earlier theories covered here focus on secrets, deception, and hidden identities scattered across the wider multiverse. This one turns the same kind of attention inward, asking whether the two characters standing at the very center of the entire show might not be two people at all, but one single, incomplete mind, split in half a long time ago, forced to keep working together simply because neither half was ever built to survive completely on its own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One theory left remains on this list, and it moves the same basic question in a very different direction entirely. Rather than splitting one mind into two, it asks what happens when an entire multiverse turns out to be full of versions of the single character everyone already assumed was the least remarkable person in the family. Section 10. The Council of Jerrys. Nobody ever looked for Jerry Smith. Exists across this entire series as a kind of built-in punching bag. The character everyone else, including his own wife and father-in-law, treats as the weakest link in the family. He struggles to hold a steady job. He gets dismissed constantly by Rick, who rarely bothers hiding his contempt. Even Summer and Morty, at different points across the show, treat him with a kind of casual disrespect that would feel cruel directed at almost anyone else in the cast. The show builds this reputation carefully and consistently, episode after episode, until it becomes one of the most reliable running jokes across the entire series. Jerry is the one member of this family nobody expects anything from. That exact reputation is what makes this final theory land as hard as it does. Because buried inside the show's own confirmed lore sits a structural detail that, once fans noticed it, made an old joke about Jerry start to look like something far bigger than a punchline. The detail comes from an idea the show establishes clearly during the first season finale, in the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. That episode reveals, for the first time, that Rick is not one man having adventures. He is one version of a man who exists in countless copies, spread across countless dimensions, organized well enough to have built an entire functioning society for managing all of them together. This society is called the Council of Ricks, and it comes complete with its own government, its own justice system, and its own internal politics, all built specifically around the fact that there are enough versions of Rick scattered across the multiverse to require some kind of formal structure just to keep them from colliding into total chaos. Once the show establishes that a Council of Ricks exists, built entirely around the sheer number of nearly identical Ricks scattered throughout infinite dimensions, it creates a logical problem the show itself never directly addresses again. If enough different versions of Rick exist to justify building an entire governing council, the same basic math should apply to every other member of this family as well. There should be enough different versions of Beth, enough different versions of Summer, enough different versions of Morty, and enough different versions of Jerry scattered across those same infinite dimensions to justify similar councils forming around any one of them, assuming the right circumstances ever pushed things that far. The show gives fans one more piece of confirmed evidence supporting exactly this idea, and it comes from a much smaller, much less dramatic scene than the reveal of the Council of Ricks itself. In the episode Morty Night Run, Rick drops Jerry off at a place called Jerry Baree, while he and Morty go handle an unrelated adventure without him. Jerry Baree functions almost exactly like a daycare center, except every single person being dropped off that day is a fully grown man named Jerry. Jerry receives a numbered ticket upon arrival, and the number printed on that ticket places him far down a long line of other Jerrys already waiting ahead of him, all dropped off that same day, all coming from other versions of this exact same family structure. This single scene confirms something important without needing any further explanation. Just as there are enough Ricks scattered across the multiverse to justify building an entire council, there are also enough Jerrys scattered across that same multiverse to justify building an entire daycare system built specifically around managing them in bulk. The show never draws a direct line connecting these two facts together itself. It simply establishes both of them separately in two different episodes, months apart, and lets the audience notice the pattern on their own, if they happen to be paying close enough attention. Fans eventually did notice, and once they did, a specific question started spreading across forums and video essays built around exactly this overlooked math. If a Council of Ricks exists, built entirely around managing an enormous surplus of nearly identical geniuses, could there also exist, somewhere out in that same infinite multiverse, a Council of Jerrys, built around around an entirely different premise. Not a council formed to manage genius, a council formed around discovering that in certain rare dimensions, purely by chance, Jerry turned out to be the intelligent one instead of Rick. This idea gained real traction specifically because the show had already given fans a small taste of exactly this kind of reversal. Tucked away inside an earlier episode, most casual viewers barely remember in detail. During the events of Rick Potion number 9, discussed earlier in this list, Rick and Morty jump into a neighboring dimension after their own home planet is overrun by grotesque, deformed creatures called Cronenbergs, a disaster caused entirely by one of Rick's own failed experiments. In this neighboring dimension, they discover a version of Beth, Jerry, and Summer whose own Rick and Morty had already solved this exact same Cronenberg crisis, successfully curing their population before dying moments later in an unrelated accident. The show never explores this alternate Beth, Jerry, and Summer in any real depth, since the entire point of the scene is Rick and Morty quietly taking over their lives without ever being caught. But fans, looking closely at the small amount of information the show does provide about this other family, started asking what kind of household could successfully survive and recover from a disaster this severe without needing to abandon their entire dimension, the way our own Rick and Morty chose to do. Some fans have speculated that a Jerry, capable of holding a family together through that kind of crisis, rather than watching his own Rick simply run away from the consequences, might represent something closer to a version of Jerry with real competence hiding somewhere underneath the surface, even if the show itself never confirms this idea directly. This speculation connects to something Watch Mojo specifically documented as a circulating fan theory following the show's 5th season finale, an episode that reveals the existence of something called the Central Finite Curve, a kind of boundary separating every dimension where Rick is guaranteed to be the most intelligent and dangerous version of himself from every other dimension outside that boundary. Once fans learned this boundary existed, and once they learned it could eventually be broken or escaped, exactly as Evil Morty does at the end of that same episode, an obvious question followed naturally. If the Central Finite Curve exists specifically to separate dimensions where Rick is guaranteed to be the smartest being around, what exists on the other side of that boundary? Fans speculating about this question raised the possibility of a multiversal council made up of Jerrys from dimensions where Jerry, rather than Rick, ended up being the most intelligent person around. A reversal made possible by the same basic multiverse rules the show had already spent years establishing as fact. The appeal of this specific theory comes from how completely it would flip everything the audience has been trained to assume across the entire run of the show. Rick is positioned again and again as the smartest character in almost every room he enters, a reputation reinforced constantly through his own arrogance and through how easily he outsmarts nearly every enemy he faces. Jerry is positioned just as consistently as the opposite, a character defined by insecurity, failure, and a complete lack of any special skill or intelligence worth noticing. A council built entirely around versions of Jerry smart enough to rival or even surpass Rick would not simply add a new piece of lore to the show. It would directly contradict one of the most stable, repeated assumptions the entire series has spent years building, using nothing more than the same basic multiverse logic the show itself already relies on constantly. There is something almost comforting buried inside this specific theory that separates it from most of the darker ideas covered earlier in this list. The theories involving Rick replacing dead versions of himself, or a young Morty growing up into a calculating political villain, carry real weight and real sadness underneath them. A council of Jerrys carries something closer to hope instead. It suggests that even a character treated this harshly, this consistently by nearly everyone around him across years of episodes, might still turn out to matter somewhere else entirely, in some other version of this exact same family, simply because the multiverse is large enough to eventually produce every possible outcome given enough chances to try. Fans point to one additional piece of evidence worth adding here, coming from a completely different corner of the show's own confirmed lore. Doofus Rick, discussed earlier in this list, forms one of the only genuine friendships shown anywhere in the series between a version of Rick and a version of Jerry, treating him with real warmth and real curiosity, rather than the usual dismissal Jerry receives from nearly every other Rick he ever encounters. That single friendship, brief as it is, hints at something the show rarely allows itself to explore directly. Jerry, given the right circumstances and the right person willing to actually engage with him honestly, might be capable of far more than the rest of his family has ever given him credit for. A council of Jerry Jerry's theory simply takes that same small hint and stretches it across the entire multiverse, imagining an infinite number of chances for that exact kind of respect to eventually take root somewhere, even if it never fully takes root here. None of this theory comes anywhere close to being confirmed by the show itself. No episode has ever shown a Council of Jerry's directly. No character has ever referenced one existing anywhere across the entire run of the series. The theory survives purely on structural logic, built by fans taking two confirmed facts, the existence of the Council of Ricks and the existence of Jerry Baree, and following the exact same reasoning the show already used to build its own multiverse rules toward a conclusion the writers themselves have never actually explored on screen. That is precisely why this theory belongs at the very end of a list built around fan speculation rather than confirmed canon. It takes the show's own established logic completely seriously, and then pushes that logic somewhere the show never bothered to go itself. What makes this final theory such a fitting note to end on is how directly it circles back to nearly everything else already covered across this entire list. Every theory here starts from the same basic assumption, that a universe built on infinite copies of the same handful of people cannot possibly produce identical outcomes every single time. Some copies of Rick turn out calm and kind instead of arrogant and cold. Some copies of Beth choose adventure over family, and some choose family over adventure, without either choice making one version more real than the other. Some copies of Morty grow up gentle, and at least one grows up patient enough to seize control of an entire society built by countless versions of the man who once abandoned him. If the multiverse is truly this wide, this varied, and this willing to produce every possible version of every possible person, then somewhere out there, among trillions of different combinations, a Jerry good enough, sharp enough, and steady enough to lead his own council was never actually impossible at all. It may simply be waiting in a dimension nobody watching this particular family ever thought to check. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.